Hello everyone, and welcome to my CBS Wonderful Today channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. On a crisp Genoa city autumn, the kind that makes the glass halls of Newman Enterprises radiance like polished sword, a secret was set in stir that would shoot shockwaves through the lives of the Abbotts, the Newmans, and the Chancellor Heritage ever. In a private suite at the Grand Phoenix, far from prying eyes and brooding cognizance, Victor Newman requested a meeting with a woman he'd formerly loved, battled, and no way completely escaped, Jill Abbott. It wasn't a social visit. It wasn't a nostalgic reunion. It was a reckoning. And when the words "here's my son" left Victor's lips, the foundation of Billy Abbott's world began to crack. Victor stood at the window overlooking the megacity he'd conquered time and again, hands clasped behind his reverse, posture rigid and controlled. He didn't turn when Jill entered. He didn't need to. He knew her incense, her confident stride, the unmistakable presence of a woman who had clawed her way to power in a world that tried to dwindle her. Jill, ever sharp, incontinently tasted the graveness in the room. Victor Newman didn't summon people for idle chatter, however. It meant war, or disclosure, if he called. "What's it this time, Victor?" Jill asked coolly, setting her bag down but keeping her guard high. "Another warning about Billy? Another vaticination about how he's going to buckle?" Victor eventually turned, his dark eyes undecipherable. "This isn't about prognostications," he said in that low, controlled tone that had scarified boardrooms and adversaries likewise. "It's about verity." Jill strengthened. In Genoa City, verity was frequently more dangerous than falsehoods. Victor approached sluggishly, designedly. "There was a time," he began, "when you and I were nearer than either of us would ever admit intimately. Passionate. Reckless." Jill crossed her arms. "Extra me the trip down memory lane." Victor didn't blench. "During that time you told me you were certain about Billy's maternity." A flicker passed over Jill's face. Subtle. Quick. But Victor caught it. "You told me John Abbott was his father," Victor continued, representing the late primogenitor of the Abbott family, a man whose heritage still defined the halls of Jabot. "But certainty and verity aren't always the same thing." Jill's countenance faltered for the first time. "What are you inferring?" Victor stepped closer. "I had a DNA test conducted." Silence. The air between them thickened, heavy and suffocating. "You had no right," Jill rumored. "I had every right," Victor combated sprucely. "Especially if the results concern my blood." Jill's heart pounded in her cognizance. She had buried certain dubieties decades ago. In a moment of vulnerability and fear, she had induced herself that her son was an Abbott through and through. It had been easier, cleaner, lower explosive. But Victor had always had a way of exhuming the history. "What did it say?" Jill eventually demanded, her voice pulsing despite her sweats to undergird it. Victor didn't vacillate. "Billy is my son." The words exploded in the room. Jill staggered back slightly, gripping the edge of the table for support. "That's insolvable." "It's wisdom," Victor replied coldly. "Not enterprise. Not scuttlebutt. Fact." Jill's mind contended. Every memory of Billy's freakishness, his defiance, his hunger for confirmation, his reckless ambition, it all replayed in a different light. The temper. The need to prove himself. The endless contest with authority numbers. Victor Newman traits. "You're lying," she indicted weakly. Victor's jaw tensed. "I doen't lie about my children." And that was true. Whatever additional Victor Newman had done in his life, manipulated requests, crushed rivals, finagled vengeance, he had always been fiercely, obsessively defensive of his seed. Victoria Newman, Nick Newman, and indeed his more complicated connections with others bearing the Newman name, family was sacred to him. Power of pedigrees signified. Jill sank into a precedent, shock giving way to wrathfulness. "Why now?" she demanded. "Why dig this up after all these times? Billy has erected his identity around being an Abbott. Around living up to John's name." Victor's expression hardened. "Because I see myself in him. Because I've watched him tone destruct and rise again. Because every time he challenges me, Every time he looks at me with that fire in his eyes, I see my reflection. The recrimination was ruinous. Billy's lifelong contest with Victor wasn't just commercial warfare. It was father versus son, intentionally locked in battle. And you suppose telling him will fix that? Jill snapped. You suppose he'll grasp you? Thank you? Victor's voice dropped. He deserves to know who he is. But beneath that protestation was commodity more complicated. Control, however. Also Billy was Newman, if Billy was his son. And if Billy was Newman, also Victor had a claim. Meanwhile, across city at Jabot, Billy Abbott was fully ignorant that his world was seconds down from shifting on its axis. He was in the middle of a tense discussion with Jack Abbott, arguing about strategy, about threat, about the direction of the company their father had erected. Billy felt the familiar pressure of living in Jack's shadow, of constantly being compared to a heritage he both deified and begrudged. You do'n't trust me, Billy indicted. I trust you to be passionate, Jack replied precisely. But passion without restraint can bring us everything. Billy bristled. It was the same argument they'd had in different forms for times. Billy the reckless bone. Billy the screw-up. Billy the black lamb. If only he knew how ironic that marker was about to come. Back at the Grand Phoenix, Jill eventually stood, fury catching shock. However, you're incorrect. If you suppose you're going to march into his life and claim him like an asset accession. Victor's eyes narrowed. He's my son. He's my son, Jill shot back. And he has suffered enough under your manipulations without adding this stunner. Victor moved toward the door. He'll hear it from me. Jill's voice broke. Victor, please. That single word please carried decades of history. Love, treason, remorse. Victor broke. For a bit of an alternate, the iron facade cracked. But only slightly. I'll handle this, he said still. And with that, he left. Jill collapsed back into her president, gashes streaming freely now. She allowed. Of John Abbott, of the stability he'd given Billy, of the sense of belonging that had anchored her son through his darkest moments. If Victor was right, if Billy was biologically a Newman, also everything she had defended was a taradiddle. Hours latterly, Victor summoned Billy to Newman Enterprises under the pretense of a business proposition. Billy arrived bothered but curious, awaiting another power play. He paraded into Victor's office with his usual swagger. What do you want now? Billy asked bluntly. Victor signaled for him to sit. This isn't about business. Billy laughed dryly. That's new. Victor studied him precisely. The posture, the intensity, the stubborn pride. There's commodity you need to know, Victor began. Billy rolled his eyes. Extra me the lecture. This concerns your maternity. The humor drained from Billy's face. What? Victor didn't soften the blow. You aren't John Abbott's natural son. Billy stood suddenly. Don't you dare. I had a DNA test conducted. It confirms what I suspected. Billy's hands gripped into fists. You're insane. Victor met his fury without blinking. I'm your father. The words hit Billy like a physical blow. For a moment, he couldn't breathe. Couldn't suppose. His entire identity, Abbott heir at law, John's son, Jack's family, splintered in a moment. You're lying, Billy rumored. However, doubt had formally begun to creep in. Memories surfaced, Jill's evasiveness when he'd formally asked about the history. The strange pressure whenever Victor was mentioned. I've evidence, Victor said, sliding a brochure across the office. Billy goggled at it as though it were radioactive. Opening it meant stepping into a reality he wasn't sure he could survive. Why? Billy demanded hoarsely. Why would you do this? Because you earn the verity, Victor replied. And because blood matters. Billy let out a bitter laugh. Blood? You suppose that makes us family? You suppose that erases decades of you trying to crush me? Victor's voice stoned. Maybe our battles make further sense now. Billy's mind reeled. Every battle, every clash of choices, it wasn't just contest. It was commodity primitive. You do'n't get to claim me, Billy said fiercely. You do'n't get to rewrite my life. Victor stood. You're a Newman. I'm an Abbott, Billy shot back, voice breaking. John Abbott was my father. And in his heart, that would always be true. Billy stormed out, the brochure left unopened on Victor's office. Word spread snappily in Genoa City, as it always did. Jill's fear, Victor's quiet confidence, Billy's explosive exit from Newman Enterprises. Jack was blindsided when Billy brazened him, rage and heartache colliding. Did you know? Billy demanded. Jack's confusion was genuine. Know what? Victor claims he's my father. The silence that followed was ruinous. Jack felt as though someone had punched him in the gut. That's insolvable. But mistrustfulness flitted. If the DNA proved it also, what did that mean for the Abbott heritage? Victoria and Nick were inversely stupefied when Victor informed them. Victoria, fiercely defensive of the Newman name, plotted to reuse the idea of Billy as her family. Nick was more reflective, fating the irony of time spent battling a man who participated their blood. Genoa City was no foreigner to secrets. But this one hovered to redraw every alliance, every contest. For Billy, the internal war was the worst of it. Alone in his apartment, he eventually opened the brochure. The cold wave, clinical language of inheritable evidence goggled back at him. Probability of maternity 99.99. He sank onto the settee, world spinning. He allowed. Of John. Of the pride in his eyes. Of the unconditional love. That couldn't be cancelled by a test. But biology had its own weight. The question wasn't just who his father was. It was who he was. Victor, watching the megacity lights from his office, believed he'd done the right thing. He believed verity, still painful, was power. But he undervalued one thing. Billy Abbott, Newman or not, had no way replied predictably. And as the storm gathered over Genoa City, one thing came clear. This disclosure would unite father and son. It would enkindle a war unlike any they had fought ahead. Because blood may bind. But in Genoa City, it also burns. 4 days after Victor's disclosure, Genoa City felt different, like the air itself was charged, staying for lightning to strike. At Newman Enterprises, workers rumored in hallways. At Jabot, directors changed cautious ganders whenever Billy's name came up. And at Chancellor, Jill locked herself inside her office, replaying every decision she had made decades ago, wondering which moment had sealed this fate. Billy didn't go to work the coming morning. He didn't answer Jack's calls. He ignored Jill's frantic dispatches. He indeed let Victoria's textbook sit unlettered, though her name lighting up his screen made his casket strain in a way he couldn't explain. Rather, he drove erratically, ultimately pulling up outside the Abbott manse, the house that had always represented safety and belonging. He sat in his auto for nearly 20 twinkles, gaping at the frontal door, flashing back running through it as a child, scraped knees and all, knowing John Abbott would be outside, steady and strong. John wasn't his natural father. But John had been his pater. And that distinction now felt like a cutter. When Billy eventually stepped outside, the familiar scent of polished wood and coffee wrapped around him. It should have assured him. Rather, it felt fragile. Jack was staying. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at his youngish family, really looked at him. The wrathfulness in Billy's posture. The query in his eyes. It's not true, Jack said still. Billy laughed, a concave sound. You sound like me history. Jack approached sluggishly. Victor manipulates. He lies. He plays games. There's a DNA test. Jack's jaw tensed. Those can be tampered with. Billy shook his head. You want to believe that? So do I. But what if it's not? The silence that followed was heavier than any argument they had ever had. Jack sat down, rubbing his tabernacles. Indeed if there's some natural link, that doesn't change who you are. You're John Abbott's son in every way that matters. Billy swallowed hard. Also, why do I feel like everything's shifted? Because it had. Meanwhile, across city, Victor wasn't celebrating. He wasn't flaunting. In fact, he was surprisingly introspective. In his private office at Newman Enterprises, he poured himself a drink and goggled at a framed snap of his children, Victoria Newman and Nick Newman smiling stiffly at the camera. Where did Billy fit in that image? He allowed. Back to every battle with Billy Abbott, The boardroom battles, the particular cuts, the constant underestimation. Had he been harder on Billy because, subconsciously, he saw himself in him? The defiance. The hunger. The turn-down to Beau. Victor had always demanded fidelity from his children. But Billy had no way owed him anything. Until now. Jill, on the other hand, was unraveling. In her suite at the Grand Phoenix, she pored over old letters, photos, recollections she had tried to seal down. There had been a window of time, detail, chaotic, when her relationship with Victor had lapped with query about Billy's generality. She had induced herself John was the father because it made sense. Because it defended her son from Victor's root. And because part of her had stressed exactly this moment. Her phone buzzed. Billy. Her heart leapt into her throat. "Mama," he said, voice flat. She exhaled shakily. "Billy. Is it true?" There was no wrathfulness in his tone. No blameworthiness. Just frustration. Jill closed her eyes. "I didn't know," she rumored. "I swear to you, I didn't know for certain." "That's not an answer. I believed John was your father. But you weren't sure." The pause said everything. Billy let out a slow breath. "You should have told me." "I didn't want you growing up under Victor's shadow," Jill said, gashes slipping down her cheeks. "His important. His ruthless. I didn't want you defined by that." Billy nearly laughed at the irony. Too late. After the call ended, Billy felt concave. Betrayed. Not just by Victor but by Jill. He'd spent his entire life trying to prove himself good of the Abbott name. Fighting for respect. Floundering with instability he could no way relatively eloquent. Now he wondered if, deep down, he'd always tasted he didn't completely belong. The media ultimately caught wind of the scuttlebutt. Anonymous sources suggested at a maternity stunner involving two of Genoa City's most important families. The enterprise alone transferred stock prices pulsing. At Jabot, Jack faced pointed questions from the board. However, one superintendent cautiously began, "What does that mean for his position then?" "If Billy is a Newman by blood." Jack's eyes flashed. "It means nothing. Billy Abbott is part of this family and this company." But indeed as he said it, query eroded at him. Over at Newman Enterprises, Victoria brazened her father. "You dropped this on us like it was a daily report," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what this does to the company? To the family?" Victor remained collected. "I revealed the verity." "And what do you anticipate now? That Billy suddenly becomes my family? That we drink him into Sunday feasts?" Victor's expression softened slightly. "He's your family." Victoria shook her head. "Blood doesn't abolish history." Nick's response was quieter, but no less complex. When he ran into Billy at Crimson Lights, the pressure was palpable. "Guess we're family," Billy murmured plaintively. Nick studied him. "You okay?" Billy scoffed. "Do I look okay?" Nick didn't push. He knew what it was like to live under Victor's prospects. To struggle with identity in the Newman shadow. "For what it's worth," Nick said precisely, "being Victor's son isn't exactly a gift." Billy managed a faint, earnest smile. "Yeah, I've noticed." But the true earthquake came days latterly. Victor called a press conference. In true Newman fashion, he wasn't going to let rumors control the narrative. Standing at the tribune in the Newman Enterprises lobby, cameras flashing, Victor delivered the advertisement with measured authority. "It has lately come to my attention through vindicated medical substantiation that William Abbott is my natural son." Gasps gurgled through the room. "While this disclosure is particular in nature, I believe translucency is necessary given the public places we all enthrall." Billy watched the broadcast from his apartment, fury rising with every word. Victor wasn't just revealing a verity. He was claiming him. Journalists incontinently suspected about heritage, commercial restructuring, power shifts. Would Billy gain shares in Newman Enterprises? Would he leave Jabot? Would this spark a junction, or a war? Jack stormed into Billy's apartment twinkles latterly. "He'd no right," Jack said, pacing. "This isn't a business succession." Billy turned off the television. "That's exactly what it feels like." Jill arrived soon after, guilt etched across her face. The three of them stood in the living room, a shattered family trying to hold on to commodity solid. "I won't let him take you," Jill said fiercely. Billy looked between them. "No bone. S taking me anywhere."